Let's get right at it. We're on Acts chapter 9, verses 19 through 31. Acts chapter 9, verses 19 through 31, going verse by verse through the book of Acts. And we're doing it expository style, one verse at a time. Our theme for this year is outward bound, and it's very challenging for people to be outward bound in our culture because there's a taboo on that they're trying to impose on us. And we're going to talk about how we're going to resist that today with some real practical things that we can do to shake the world up a little bit. We're looking at Paul's early ministry today. Paul just got converted earlier in the chapter. And if you weren't here last week, please do listen to that teaching. The conversion of Paul, which was a microwave experience for him. He got hammered by the presence of Jesus on the way to Damascus, and he couldn't unsee that. He couldn't unexperience that. That was one of those things that wasn't philosophical, wasn't theological, it was experiential. And sometimes, some people definitely need that in their lives, and he was one of those people. How to be faithful in a headwind. We're facing a spiritual headwind in our culture. It's not like our culture is encouraging us to act out our faith right now. And so how do we operate in a headwind? Who knows the difference between a tailwind and a headwind when you're riding your bike? It's a big difference. You could be on the flattest ground in the world, but if there's a headwind, it's just absolutely nasty. And we're facing that now. Church attendance was weak before the pandemic, and it's weaker even still after that. The people that are gathering now are definitely solid folks who are coming together, and we will not be shaken. We're going to move forward with the gospel as we've done over and over. But it's not encouraged by the media. It's not encouraged by the universities. It's not encouraged by the government. It's not encouraged anywhere. And so we need to adjust to that. How do we adjust our sails? If you're sailing into the wind, which you can do, by the way, you have to tack, and you have to adjust your sails and do it differently than when you're sailing with the wind. I see these guys out here on the beach with these kite sailing things, and I could never do that. I surf all the time, but kite surf, what if the wind takes you all the way to Catalina and you can't turn around? Just hanging on. I do not understand that sport at all. But anyways, let's look at Acts chapter 9, 19 through 31. We're going to get right at it, and we're going to look at some practical ways that we can tack against the wind, that we can bike against the wind, that we can actually do some things to make a difference because the winds have changed. In my lifetime, the winds have changed. I was born in 1960, and things have changed a lot since then. And there was a lot of encouragement for church going back then, and there's a lot of discouragement for being an active, practicing Christian now. So we got a headwind as opposed to a tailwind. And that will change eventually. Those things change over time. It's not always going to be a headwind. There's been headwinds and tailwinds throughout history. Americans don't understand history very well. We always think this is the most divided the country's ever been. I'm thinking, do you remember the Civil War when we killed 20% of our young men in one big battle for 3.5 years over a big issue? We've been divided, and I remember 1968, and it was way worse. Believe me, I still remember the violence and the riots and the things that went on in 1968 in our little town in Idaho, and it was scary, really scary. I asked my dad what's going on. He says, there's going to be a civil war. That's how it felt. And so we forget history sometimes. People have faced headwinds lots of times in the church. Throughout history, this has happened lots of times, and we've always prevailed. We aren't shaken. We're able to move forward. So Acts 9, 19 through 31. Saul had just been converted, Saul/Paul, Saul to the Jews, Paul to the Greeks and the Romans. As we said before, he didn't change his name at his conversion. He's still Saul here in this story because he's hanging around with Jews. Shaul, or Saul in Hebrew, was his name in the synagogue. And when he went out to the Romans and the Greeks, he was Paulos, which is Shorty, which is his nickname. It's not like God said, henceforth thou shalt be Shorty. You know, he just had a different name for different people that he hung out with. And taking food, Saul was strengthened. For some days he was with the disciples at Damascus, and it was on the road to Damascus that he ran into the risen Christ. And when you run into the risen Christ, I'm talking collision, there's a train wreck yesterday if you saw the news. It's a collision. It's a big one, and it undoes who you are. And immediately he proclaimed Jesus in the synagogues. the Jewish synagogue, saying he is the Son of God. Immediately went right out and did this. Paul, say this after me, Paul was a disruptor. And that didn't change after he was converted. Rather than disrupting the church, he was a person who would disrupt the Roman Empire and disrupt everything that was going on and basically unravel what was going on. Some of the greatest figures in history were unravelers. They were disruptors. Martin Luther was one. Martin Luther basically pulled the plug on the bathtub of the medieval worldview, and everything changed. And the modern world was born after Martin Luther created things like universal literacy. He emptied out the monasteries and the nunneries. In fact, he married a nun and had lots of kids, and a whole bunch of things happened. Lots of things changed at that point. Going to the synagogue saying he's the Son of God. I just encourage you to go do that at your local synagogue and find out what happens. It's not going to be real cheerful for you. Wasn't then, isn't now, and it causes a lot of problems. And all who heard him were amazed and said, "Is this not the man who made havoc in Jerusalem?" Once again, he was a disruptor. And of those who called upon his name. And I'm getting so excited here, I got to slow down, just breathe. And has he not come here for this purpose, to bring them bound before the chief priests? But Saul increased all the more in strength and confounded the Jews who lived in Damascus by proving that Jesus was the Christ. But many days had passed, the Jews plotted to kill him, which is a cycle which will repeat throughout the book of Acts. Wherever Paul went, people decided to kill him. That was just sort of how he brought out the worst in a lot of people. But their plot became known to Saul. They were watching the gates day and night in order to kill him. But the disciples took him by night and let him down through an opening in the wall, lowering him in a basket. And when he had come to Jerusalem, he attempted to join the disciples. And they were all afraid of him, and they did not believe that he was the disciple. Of course they were afraid of him. Of course they were afraid. They thought, I don't think so. This is not the guy. How can we trust that he's not a plant? How can we trust that he's not some kind of double agent? How can we trust that he's not out to get us? How can we trust that he's not infiltrating the church in order to rip it apart from the inside rather than from the outside? And they were all afraid of him, for they did not believe that he was a disciple. But Barnabas took him and brought him to the apostles and declared to them how on the road he had seen the Lord, who spoke to him, and how at Damascus he had preached boldly in the name of Jesus. So he went in and out among them at Jerusalem, preaching boldly in the name of the Lord. And he spoke and disputed against the Hellenists. Those are the Greek-speaking Jews. But they also were what? Seeking to kill him. So he went to Damascus and they were seeking to kill him. And then he went to Jerusalem and they were seeking to kill him. Basically, wherever Paul went, there was trouble. Jail time. In Ephesus, massive riot where people screamed themselves hoarse. Paul was a disruptor. Sometimes we need to disrupt. Sometimes we need to build. The Bible says for everything there is a season. There's times where we need to be disruptive and times where we need to build on what's there and encourage what's going on. There's a time to follow the rules and there's a time to break the rules. There's a time to do all of these things. And Paul was there in a season to disrupt, not just to encourage, but to disrupt. And when the brothers learned this, they brought him down to Caesarea and sent him off to Tarsus. They brought him to the dock and sent him off in a boat, which was another thing that would recur over and over. People would often bring him down to the dock and send him off with a one-way ticket somewhere else. And what happened then in Jerusalem? So the church throughout all Judea and Galilee and Samaria had peace. It was being built up and walking in the fear of the Lord, and in the comfort of the Holy Spirit, it multiplied. Paul was the most influential sharer of the faith there's ever been. And Paul never read a Dale Carnegie book on how to win friends and influence people. How to make enemies and get yourself in trouble. How to get thrown in jail is more like what Paul was like. So, he was a person who shared the faith. We're going to talk about sharing the faith, and here's where it gets personal. Here's where it gets personal with us and personal with me. We had a trustee meeting the other night, and we had prophetic prayer time. You might wonder, what's prophetic prayer time? Where we actually listen to the Lord. And the question was, not what programs can we come up with to be outward bound, that's our theme for this year, but what can we do to become more outward oriented in our faith? And the Lord convicted me of something. When people ask me what I do, I hesitate. Because there's a stigma on being a pastor. People think, oh my goodness, I better behave differently and all kinds of things, and they immediately get defensive. And over the years, I've gotten more and more hesitant to talk about what I do. I've even jokingly said I work in power and light, which is kind of true. But still, I was convicted of that, and I need to cut that out. I need to be a little bit more bold like Paul and just tell people what I do and have that be an opportunity to share my faith. So this affects me as much as it affects any of you. It's not me telling you what to do. It's me saying we all need to grow in our ability and our capacity to share our faith. Because we've been tabooed out of it. And I'm going to talk about that in just a second. This is a headwind. My wife is from Holland, and they actually have a headwind bicycling championship in Holland. And they wait till the wind gets really strong, and they bike into it. And ever been to Holland? They ride bikes everywhere. There's grandmas 75 years old riding their bikes in the slushy snow on the way to the grocery store. That's just how that works. And so this guy's riding into the wind. And it is a taboo in North America and in Western Europe right now to share your faith. And that was given to us by the baby boomers, and I am one. I'm one of the younger baby boomers. If you were born between 1946 and 1964, would you raise your hand? You're all sitting on this side, which is kind of weird, but there's a few over here. Yeah, mostly this is a church where most of the leadership is Gen X, which is the younger generation, but I'm a boomer, barely a boomer. And boomers came up with the idea that you can't criticize anyone else's opinion or ideology or pretend that yours is better, and you got to keep to yourself, and it's got to be private. That's sort of it even ended up in Star Trek. In Star Trek, there's the prime directive. You can't mess with the culture that's down there. You have to leave them alone. That's a very boomer thought. And it was not part of our thinking in America before the boomers showed up. So that's the gift that my generation gave to America, which has not been helpful because we can't discern now between different ideologies. Well, the truth is, folks, there are ideologies that are better than Nazism. There really are. Or Stalinist, whatever. I'd rather live in South Korea than North Korea. It's a better society. As any society that has to keep people in by fencing them in, that's a problem. That means it's an inferior culture, period. None of it. North Korea doesn't have an immigration problem. There are cultures that are better than others. There really are. And so we need to be able to just, but if you're a boomer, you can't say that because that's taboo. And you can't say following Jesus is better than not following Jesus. If you try that at work, if you try that at public school, you will get reminded that that's not okay. A little warning light will go off on the dashboard. So we're living in a culture where it's a taboo to talk about our faith, especially in the marketplace or in government or in those kind of places. So how do we deal with this new headwind? Well, what I look at here, how we fix this, I learned in South Dakota. As a student pastor in South Dakota, I spent a lot of time with farmers because all of our church members were farmers. They're all farmer families. I don't know if you know this, but in South Dakota, farmer families don't buy parts for their implements. They make them. And I was showing up with one of the Wirtz brothers, farmer, and he was working on his combine. I said, how do you know how to do this? He says, well, you don't have to know how anything works. You just have to figure out what's keeping this from working. And then you try to work from there. It's really true. the less you know about engines, the better you are at rebuilding them. You just figure out what isn't working and you just go after that. And it's amazing what an insight that is. What's keeping this from working? What's keeping us from sharing our faith? What's keeping me from sharing my faith? I know what's keeping me from sharing my faith is I'm reticent to tell people what I do. And there's something that's keeping you from sharing your faith. So let's look at those things. What's keeping it from working? Here's some roadblocks. One is the taboo we talked about. There's a cultural taboo that you can't use the J word. You can talk about the universe, but you can't talk about God. You can talk about spirituality, but everybody knows spirituality. Pick up a magazine, spirituality issue, and whatever. It's not going to include Bible or Christianity. It's going to be everything but that. Fear of the dislike. You've seen online where there's a thumbs up and a thumbs down thing. We're afraid of getting disliked because if we get disliked, our status could drop. And we depend on each other. We depend on our status being fairly high in our society. We want people to like us and support us. And what if those people most important to us start to give us the thumbs down? Well, we can take a little example from Paul, who could care less about what people thought about him and just went and did what he did. Told the truth, even if it cost him, and it cost him over and over and over and over again. But a lot of us really aren't willing to share our faith if it costs us something. We have to ask ourselves, why is that? The fear of dislike, fear of other people, what they might think of us. Not qualified. Let me tell you something. Paul was not qualified. From what we can tell from Paul's letters, he knew almost nothing about Jesus' life and teaching. He shared almost none of it. What he shared was his conversion, his filling with the Holy Spirit, and he knew the Old Testament backwards and forwards. But look through the letters of Paul and try to find something about the life of Jesus and his teaching. Good luck. He wasn't qualified. He didn't know. He wasn't walking with Jesus. He didn't know what he taught. He was way less qualified than you about Jesus. Everyone in this room knows way more about Jesus' life than he did. The Gospels hadn't been written yet. Paul wrote his letters before the Gospels were written. Who's ever been to a family reunion where the old people are starting to die? And you go there and you talk to them to try to get the story before. That's where the Gospels were written, because the apostles were starting to die. The eyewitnesses were dying. They had to get these stories down. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written at that point, after the letters of Paul. He had no access to a gospel, hadn't been with Jesus, and he wasn't qualified. But guess what? He knew less about Jesus' life than you do, and it worked. Because he had his encounter with Jesus, which was genuine. He got filled with the Holy Spirit, and he knew the story of the Old Testament. And that was good enough. God used that. If Paul was not qualified, don't go saying you're not qualified, because you know a lot more about Jesus than he did. Urgency entropy. I have seen in my lifetime a lack of urgency with evangelism. A lack of urgency with sharing our faith. Now, there's exceptions. We've got people like Stan in our church who has a real sense of urgency for sharing his faith with his family. We've got Karen who goes on mission trips. We've got people who have a sense of urgency. But in general, it doesn't appear that we take it real seriously. We've kind of become okay with people not coming to faith. Even people we love. And I kind of want to see them in eternity. Not just kind of. I do want to see them in eternity. But we've sort of lost track of that. Folks, it is possible to fail spiritually. Another thing the boomers gave us is everybody gets a trophy. We boomers messed everything up with a lot of people. But we had some great rock songs, I'll tell you that. We wrote some pretty good music. But, my goodness, it's absolutely crazy what we've done with that. Everybody gets a trophy, and so everybody's saved, everyone's going to heaven, and you go to most funerals, and that's kind of the message you get. My wife and I lived in Puget Sound, up in Seattle. If you live in the Puget Sound area, you take the ferry boats a lot. Let me tell you, you can miss the ferry. When it takes off, it's not coming back for you. You have ample opportunity to take the ferry to where you're going, but you gotta show up. Everyone doesn't get to the other side. And the idea that everyone is saved is, we don't say it that way, but we act that way. Does that make any sense? We've read our Bibles. We know that that's not true. But we act as though it is. We've lost our sense of urgency. I'm not talking panic. I'm talking just a sense of urgency, a sense of we should really care about people not being saved. No cultivation of friendships outside the church. This is especially true of long-term Christians and pastors. My 3 workplaces, Concordia University, everyone is a very committed Christian, the people I work with. They're in the leadership team of the university, and they really care about that. My work here among you folks, I'm among spirit-filled believers in a very muscular, fun-sized church that's spreading the good news. We now have a church planter who's working with us in Kenya as of 2 weeks ago. We have a lot of influence here. But you know, I kind of get a little bit high on that because I'm with Christians all the time. And I'm with Christians all the time at Concordia. And guess what? My other job is translating the Bible for the Passion Translation. And guess what I'm working with? All Christians. And all my social energy goes into, I'm not cultivating enough relationships outside. This is where new Christians often are better at sharing their faith with people on the outside because they've got more friends on the outside. Now, Shauna, you're always going to have people on the outside because you cut hair for everybody, so they're going to be coming through. But for some of us, our whole social truth is, I would rather hang out with you guys right here, and the people watching, than anyone else in the world. And I'd just as soon not hang out with other people because you guys agree with me on stuff and we get along. I don't really want to form relationships on the outside. That takes work. The longer you've been a Christian, the less likely you are to share your faith. How long had Paul been a Christian? About 5 minutes. And he was in the synagogue. So those of us how many of you have been church-going Christians for more than 15 years? Raise your hands. We're the ones at risk. We need to cultivate outside relationships. Boomer culture, no discerning. We talked about that one. No comparing, no discernment. They're all equal. All worldviews are completely equal. Star Trek, the prime directive, we talked about that one too. Media and comfort addiction. There has never been a more comfortable time to be alive. We've got the cushiest chairs. You ever see the chairs our grandparents sat on? Even the Davenport, they called it. You know, it was just a cushion this thick. Now these big old lazy boys. Notice there's no lazy girls, just lazy boys. Only Susans are lazy. You know, they got the lazy Susan thing, but but we've got these big chairs. You know, we got cup holders all over the place. We got big screen TV. Wendy got us a big screen TV for the Alpha course for less than $100. That would have cost a fortune 15 years ago. There'll be Happy Meal toys soon. You know, big screen TV comes with your Happy Meal. I mean, the comfort, the level of comfort we have right now. Wendy and I were driving home, and there's In-N-Out, flash, flash, flash last night. And we drive in, they make all this food for you, and it's wonderful, and we just eat it and go home, and they take care of the whole thing. Drive-thrus, oh my goodness. And it's cheap, and it's just not as cheap as it was 2 months ago, but still, it's... We get addicted to comfort and entertainment. This flat screen TV I just got for Sebastian's Spanish Alpha course, I took it home, tried to turn it on, and it says, search for local channels. And it searched for local channels. This is not cable, folks. Hundreds of channels showed up. Do you know that under each channel, there's more channels? Lots of them. There's like channel 50 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. You could watch that stuff all day. And we get addicted to comfort and entertainment. And we could just eat and watch TV all day long. Sounds kind of good some days. Misunderstanding science. We Christians are intimidated by science. And please hear me, I have nothing against science. My favorite line in one of my favorite movies is in Nacho Libre, where he talks to this little urchin. And he says, "Do you believe in God?" He says, "No, I believe in science." Science is very good for building and making things. Science is very good for transporting things. Science is good for figuring out a lot of mechanical things. There is nothing in science that tells you how you should live. There's nothing ethical in science. There's no truth. There's no truth, beauty, justice. There's no justice in science at all. Science is just facts. Science is important, but it doesn't tell us anything about all the important stuff. Our whole legal system is not scientific based because what is justice? Good luck figuring that out scientifically. What is beauty? My son likes to take us he loves museums. We go to museums. I don't care what you say. Some modern art is just stupid. People buy that stuff. I just think you've got to be kidding. It's just, squashed person with a motorcycle accident upside down with a flower coming out of it or something. I don't get it. There's that, you can't compare anymore. What I'm saying here is science is very helpful. It's a tool, but it says nothing about how to live our lives. You don't have to be intimidated by science. Science doesn't tell us what we're doing here or what we should be doing here or how you should treat your friends and your spouse and your kids. It says nothing about that. Or how we should deal with criminals or how we should, no. Who we should vote for. There's no scientific stuff. That's not science. 90% of our life is not science and never will be. So we don't have to be intimidated by science. So, helpful thinking and actions. Hitting a few pins. In bowling, you don't have to throw a strike every time when you're sharing your faith. Just hit a few pins and don't throw a gutter ball. Hit a few pins and let someone else hit a few pins. If you can come out of a conversation and people think Christians might be okay and God might like me, you've hit a few pins. You don't have to throw a strike every time. You don't have to come across a Muslim terrorist and turn him into a missionary in 5 minutes. It's not going to happen. Hit a few pins. With a Muslim, that's pretty easy. You guys really honor Jesus, don't you? And they do. It's a big deal for Muslims. What encounters have you had with Jesus? Hit a few pins. Don't argue about the Trinity. Holy smokes, nobody's ever reached a Muslim arguing about the Trinity. But bring them to Jesus. There's ways of doing that. There's ways of hitting a few pins. Let someone else hit a few pins. As a pastor, I often get to be the person who hits the last pin. But usually I should be giving thanks to all the people who've hit the other pins along the way. That's important. Telling your story. This is something that was brought up in our Bible study this morning. Judy brought it up. Telling your story is really important because people can't argue with your testimony. People can argue with your theology, but they can't argue with what God's done in your life. And sharing what God has done in your life can make a big difference. Longtime believers, we have to wake up to the fact that we're not sharing our faith much. And the longer you've been a Christian, the more likely it is, unless you've been very intentional, and unless it's a real passion, we stop doing it at a certain point because we want to hang around with our church friends. Invite people to Christmas, Easter, and Alpha. For people who don't want to come to church, very often they'll come at Christmas. Very often they'll come at Easter. What are you doing for Easter? We're going to church. You want to come to church for Easter? They think it's a one-time thing, and who knows? The Alpha course, Wednesday nights. We've got a great turnout, but we'd love to have all the people who are coming invite people who don't know the Lord to the course. That would be wonderful. Bring some people who don't know the Lord. There's a new thing coming out at the Super Bowl called He Gets Us. A bunch of rich people who are anonymous put up $100 million to talk about Jesus. And the website is called He Gets Us. And it talks about how Jesus understands us. And how Jesus was sick of politics too. And how Jesus did this and Jesus did that. And it's very interesting. When you're watching the Super Bowl and the He Gets Us ad comes up, and it will, they're doing an ad of the Super Bowl, start a conversation with people. What do you think of that? What do you think of that? The whole world will be watching the Super Bowl, for goodness sake, so pay attention to this thing. It's non-denominational. There's Catholics, Protestants, everybody taking part in it. And it's all about reintroducing people to Jesus. And the Jesus of the Bible, not just some construct. Watch for that. Avoid ideological defensiveness. A lot of people who are into apologetics just get crabby and argumentative. If you don't believe me, go on Twitter. And just get cranky. Don't become a cranky Christian. It's not attractive. Avoid ideological defensiveness, getting all defensive. Jesus ignored his culture wars. The secret to bringing Jesus to the world is not to win the culture wars. The culture wars will come and go, and there'll be other culture wars. And guess what? Jesus will still be around. Tamara and I have worked so hard to avoid the culture wars throughout this whole thing, because that's not what the gospel's about. It's not about our side, their side. It's about bringing Jesus to people. And the best argument I've ever had for coming to faith is the design argument. I was a philosophy major in college. I did Fulbright work in philosophy. And by far the most convincing argument for the existence of God is the design of nature. I don't know how anybody could look at a hummingbird and not believe in design, or DNA, or I wish my car repaired itself like my arm does when it gets cut. Wouldn't that be nice if tires just repaired themselves and you would never need an oil change and all that stuff? It's miraculous. Nature is, a lot of agnostics and atheists just don't get outside enough. They don't see nature. I have never met a surfer. I've met some surfers who are pretty weird, but I've never met one who is a hardcore atheist, because they're out in nature all the time. They may not understand the biblical story that well, but none of them are atheists. There's a spiritual sense to being outdoors. Getting outdoors, gardening, being outside, we live in a beautiful part of the country. People, our doors are open here. That's normal to you. It's not normal in the rest of the country right now. Semis are sliding off the ice, and people are living in horrible conditions. And we live here. I've known people who live in Huntington Beach, and I'll mention I go to the beach, and they'll say, yeah, I've lived here for 30 years. I don't go to the beach hardly ever. I'm thinking, then go live somewhere cheaper. Yeah. If you're going to stay indoors, live in Omaha. Just get a big screen TV, live in Omaha. Just what are you doing here? And one of the best evangelistic questions you can ever ask is, do you ever pray? And you know what? I've never heard anybody say no. And the follow-up question is, how can I pray for you right now? What do you need prayer for? Everybody wants prayer. Do you know that, this is really funny, the same percentage of atheists pray every week as Christians? Surveys have been done. When people are in trouble, they pray. When people get to the end of their rope, they just start praying. It's a natural human thing. It's not a learned behavior. Praying is like breathing. It's what you do when you don't know what to do. And people want to pray. I'll close with this story, but I used to snowboard way too much. And I would get on the chairlift, and I always went by myself. And everybody was half my age, because snowboarding was not a person, somebody my age would do much. And I'd be with these young guys. And the minute we took off from the bottom on the chairlift, I'd say, I'm a Bible teacher. What do you guys do? And they realize they're stuck, because they can't jump. But it was my sweetest evangelistic times ever. I did it for years. And I would always say, do you guys ever pray? And every single person says yes. Every single person said yes. How can I pray for you? And they pull out their earbuds and, right now? And, I'm bigger than they are, so they go along with it. Because we're up, pretty high above the ground. But they all had stuff they wanted to pray for. They all had struggles in their lives. And the rest of the day, if they ever passed me, hey, they'd wave at me and stuff, because they'll never forget it. I had a captive audience on the chairlift. But asking people how they need prayer is a wonderful way to share your faith. Well, for those of you who are watching online, I'd like you to think of ways you can share your faith. But for those of you here, I'd like to separate into 4 groups. Behind Jen, there's a line behind you, Jen, and there's a line behind Dwayne. So there's 4 groups here, 1, 2, 3, 4. I'd like to pass these out. So Tamara, for once, I'm going to have you pass stuff out. You're always having me pass out stuff. And what we've got here, Alan, can I have you pass out the ones to this side? We're going to process this. So go ahead and move your chairs around and get in groups. And I've given you a list of things, but you can come up with your own. I'd like you to list the top 3 things you can do that would work for you to share your faith. Now, please hear me. There's no best way to do this, and God will use your personality to share the faith the way that you should share it. We're not all going to be Paul. Some of us are going to share our faith in different ways. I listed a whole bunch of different things you can do here. But what I'd like you to do is to ask yourself, which of these 3 resonate with me? Which of these 3 fit my personality? Which of these 3 things can I start doing? Which of these 3 things are something that wouldn't be terribly scary for me? So go ahead and get a pen. I put pens on the side there, and write in for yourself which of the 3 at the bottom list here work for you, and share that with the group. And if something isn't on the list, go ahead and put it on the list. It doesn't have to be one of these things. But which of these things start working for you? We have to be intentional and specific. The last thing I want is for people just to leave thinking, well, I ought to share my faith more, but have no real tools for doing it. So think in terms of which of these work for you, and share with your group what your top 3 are and the ones you're most likely to implement.